Hopefully I don't have like any internet problems or anything, but we'll see how that goes. But yeah, it's been it like our last conversation, I don't know if that was like about 3 months ago, maybe somewhere around that.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah, and it's crazy how many things have happened, not only on like a global scale, but also like on my own personal like journey and stuff. Like it's wild. Like, yeah, I mean, just so many things. Let me start here. So one thing that like I'll just tell you like the story as it happened. Um, I am I don't know, I would describe myself as agnostic. Um, enough to the point where like most of my life I would have said, agnostic, and enough to the point where it's like I don't really think about, I don't think that I'm not going to claim that there is no God, but I will say that I don't believe that divine intervention happens, right? I don't believe that if I go to a casino and I'm a good person and God is looking out for me, that he's going to make it, more likely that I'm going to, end up making enough to feed my family. And I think that's a really key like difference in how like you can kind of live your life depending on, how you perceive things. But I've always been open to, a more abstract idea of what God could be, right? Like I don't, I can believe in the idea of a creator, a creator capable of divine intervention, sure. But also, it's like I just try not to think about it too much because I also accept the fact that like I will never know, right? Like there's even if you are religious or you're not religious, then you can never truly know with 100% certainty, like, what we're all here for, how we got here, all that. Um, so I don't know, like anybody who knew me for like well over like 15, 17, I don't know, I grew up, I was a little bit, I was raised in like Catholicism, but it's just like kind of like sometimes we go, sometimes we don't, but it wasn't like super strict. But like I don't know the exact point where I was like, I moved more towards like agnosticism, or I just, it happened gradually over time, and I wasn't like super observant of it or anything. It just was. And so, but for a long time, like I definitely perceived things in a way that like is, devoid of like any possible like concept of divine intervention or any, possible whatever. But I also, so here's what happened. And this is also relevant to like the email that I originally sent you. Um, it was just like because that email was I double checked the timestamp after I sent it because I kind of forgot about it and like moved on. But it was like a few days or whatever before Charlie Kirk died, which was on like September 10th. Um, and around that same period of time, I I don't know what it was. I just had like a bad feeling, right? So I'm just gonna tell the story. Like I always feel like a little bit of judgment because I judge myself for like the whole like the way that like I perceived, I don't know. I have a YouTube comment section in my head that I always like, judge myself from different people's lenses sometimes. Um, but so what happened was right before Charlie Kirk died. It was around like September 8th or something. Like I just had a bad feeling that like something was, going to culminate. Enough to the point where like I made a post on Facebook, and it's like, to my own friends and stuff, but like, you know, I I didn't say with 100% certainty that there's going to be a false flag event, but I did say like I put myself out there in a way that I typically would never put myself out there, especially to make a claim that like, I get a feeling that something is going to happen, and especially within a time window of like, the way I even described it in the post was, kind of I'm kind of like predicting like the birth of a baby. Like, it's like, yeah, is he going to be on the due date or a couple days after or whatever? I mean, like mathematically, logically speaking, like the most probable date, if there were going to be like some kind of false flag event or something happening, in my mind, I was thinking like prior to anything happening, it would be like on 9/11, right? Like that just seems like a more probable date for any type of terrorist thing. Even if it wasn't a false flag terrorist, attack or something like that that happened, um, they can still they can still optimize and seize the fact that like if something happened, they can use that to fuel their agenda for whatever they're trying to get accomplished. And by they, I just mean like, the government in general. Like that's kind of how every like that's kind of how the original 9/11 happened. Whether you believe it was a conspiracy or whether, it was an actual genuine, attack that had no ties at all to America, it still was used as a justification for getting into like a proxy war with, a country that wasn't really responsible for the attack itself. Um, so that happens quite often. Like that's like the idea of I think manufacturing consent to some degree, where it's just like something bad happens and we can take advantage of public reaction to get the public to move in the way that we want them to move. Like, we want to have a war with, Afghanistan because we want oil or something, just a hypothetical. But like if, we don't know how to get people to just, agree to doing a war for no reason. But if there's a terrorist attack, we can say, oh, well, look, there's a imminent threat. And therefore, because there's a big threat, we have to, expand our military and we have to go out and, do things. Um, so I just had like a feeling that there would be
That
like,
something of that sort was going to happen. Like,
yeah,
yeah, that like, near our correspondence. And given that we are mutual agnostics here, right? Sometimes there are those times where it's like, oh, there's some sort of feeling that is, spiritual, but we wouldn't necessarily chalk it up to like a divine intervention, right? Because we have that skepticism probably for many reasons, maybe, for different reasons, right? Well, we're skeptical of a divine figure, let alone a divine figure that would intercede in the world.
right. So it definitely, admittedly, it didn't happen the way that I would have, pictured it. The way I described it, like like I said, like you said, like I am very much, a skeptic. And so even as I frame everything that I'm saying, in this prediction, I'm acknowledging that, like, well, part of, I just saw like, there was, a growing kind of divide going on in the right already, especially over like, I think Israel is a sore point for the right as of right now, in terms of like just infighting. And I saw that there was some like, growing divide there. I was able to, like obviously if I'm listening to the Theo Von podcast and he's bringing on like a doctor from Gaza to say that like, oh yeah, this shit is real and these are like, we literally can't even get supplies because like they won't allow supplies in, to treat people who have been medically, harmed, civilians,
But
normal.
I would even say with someone like Theo Von, like I don't know how expressly political he is. While like he
I
has
would say he's not necessarily right, but he appeals to people of that demographic, I think.
yeah, well I mean I have found him funny in many instances. He's
I
certainly
think
not
he's
a
hilarious. I
yeah.
love Theo for the record. I'm not, I have no negative opinions of Theo, but I do think that
Yeah,
like
but he's certainly not a
obviously Rogan
figure.
is another example where he has been
Rogan's a lot more
outspoken.
blatant.
He is
Yeah.
outspoken against, the war in Gaza as well.
But with
And
someone like Theo,
and
Theo
then
is
Tucker
someone
Carlson has gotten more so. Candace Owens, you look at like, it's a theme where it becomes obviously Marjorie Taylor Greene. There's just more there's more speaking out on that.
right, but I think to point to that very divide, you have someone like Theo that's not very like careful with his wording, right? To say the
Right.
least, right? He's
Yeah,
not
yeah, I agree with
interested
that.
in like so I think that's in a sense why he appeals to the right. And it all shows a lot of the shallowness of what connected to, the right together was this sort of dislike of the sort of, identity politics and the sort of politics that were based upon political correctness. And while we can see through Theo's things, when like Theo's clips were used in an ICE video, he's like, what do you like? No, I don't support this. I don't like this, right? So you have Theo himself, right? He's not a politically correct individual, but his politics are a lot more nuanced. But
Right.
members of the right you write around him for his political, sorry, lack thereof political correctness.
I
Then you
think
have
there is
South
definitely,
Park,
I'm
which is,
sorry, I
sorry,
didn't want
just
to cut you
last
off.
example. No, 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 last example. Like with South Park, right? You have a show that, appealed to a lot of people on the right because of its lack of political correctness. But I think a lot of people on the right made this sort of assumption that like, oh, political correctness is something that belongs to our domain. And there has been this like resurgence of, non-politically correct leftism that has been putting also, in addition to everything you're saying, a divide within the right. Because it's like, okay, well, wait a sec, right? If our whole thing was about political correctness and we see a broader spectrum of political uncorrectness, for lack of a better phrase, then what are we doing here in this camp? So yeah, it's definitely Israel as I think the big one for sure. But I think it's also the bases of like immigration and the bases of political correctness. There's a couple and economic stuff for sure. Like there's a bunch of factors coming therein. And but I do think the overrated one is Israel and the underrated one is political correctness. Because initially we can see Trump's movement as a movement of, you know, political correctness mainly, even though the frustrations were towards economics, right?
Right.
There weren't solutions. So it's the here, I have the solution for your economic woes. It's all this politically correct sort of stuff. And also obviously how that has um, also, been weaponized to hurt minority individuals, right? Be they in
Right.
Gaza or be they, undocumented individuals in the United States.
Right. I mean, I definitely think there's like a subsection of people who more than anything, they have good values, right? Even values that like, they're not anti anything inherently, but they want the ability to be politically incorrect and they want the ability to just have I mean when I hate the way people use the word freedom of speech because it doesn't it's very inconsistently used, I think. There's for example, it's like, oh, I want the right to be able to, call somebody a fag, but like I don't want trans people to have the right to like read to children or something. Like it just like some or the book bans is a great example of, suppression of free speech, but you're very targeted and compartmentalized in what it is you're suppressing. I think almost everybody would possibly agree that some form of, speech does need to be suppressed because it can.
I'm actually in the disagreement camp
Oh,
on that.
really?
I'm a free speech extremist, and still to
Can
this
we can
day.
we put a pin in that? I do want to
Yes,
talk
we
about
can.
that. I just want to get to like kind of the end of what I was getting at because it's a wild thing for me. Like even as I'm explaining it, part of why I'm like taking so long to get to it is because I judge myself a little, like, because of the experience, right? So so this is what happened. Like I also saw that, the writing was kind of on the wall for Mamdani at that point. He wasn't guaranteed to win, but he it looked like he was going to. And then you see, there's I mean, this is, the thing that in terms of Israel, it's just like it's odd that like that Democrats and Republicans. When I say Democrats, I mean like establishment Democrats. Everybody like Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, Gavin Newsom, Cory Booker, etc. Every like these people are obviously pro-Israel, but then there's also, the sections of the right that are the same thing. And there is a large grassroots movement, I think, that is against, funding that in any capacity, but there is no representative majority for like the people that, don't want that war, or don't want to fund it anyways. Um, and so part of like what I see, seeping through the cracks is that, like somebody like Mamdani, he was able to win in spite of that because like, there does seem to be some level of even within the right, there's arguments about free speech and stuff, but it's like they're arguing to some degree about like the suppression of the ability to even speak out against it. It's not even about like, can or like it's not about whether you are in favor or not in favor of the war, but also about like whether you can even have an open discussion about it without being labeled as an anti-Semite. But I'm getting on to like a different thing. But I just, I saw this pattern. like going on, going up into like, September. So it was like around September 8th, and that's around when I wrote you the email because in my mind, like I don't know, like in general, I mean, there's also just been like nonstop propaganda. That's how it's always been for a while now. But I just, I felt like okay, something has got like if if I am somebody who is in power and I want the war in Israel to go on, but I understand that the majority of the population, both Republicans and Democrat voters, right, are against that, then I need to come up with some kind of justification for that war. Otherwise, like I'm going to be unpopular. So it's either, be unpopular or come up with a way to manufacture consent. So it just seemed to me like, something had to happen because like they were already starting to kind of fall apart. And I think that divide has only grown a little bit more since that point. But like,
Yeah, for sure.
um, I
Well,
I
especially with the greater platforming, not necessarily greater popularity. That's kind of a misnomer, but the greater platforming of Nick Fuentes shows that,
yeah.
along with a couple of other very disgusting things. But
Yeah, I
yes,
mean, so yeah, like, and we can probably talk about that too when we get back to like, what free speech, should be allowed and such, because, Nick Fuentes is another like controversial person. And, I just feel like, he is an extension of, like Trump push the Overton window further to the right, and now Nick Fuentes is kind of a normalized person, right? Like that wouldn't have been normalized 10 years ago, especially not in the middle of the most what people would call woke eras of all time. But so here's what happened is, first of all, I swear, I mean, I might have like, skimmed past like, a Charlie Kirk video on TikTok at one point, but I did not know who Charlie Kirk was. I just wasn't paying attention at that time, and didn't fully understand. Like I didn't fully understand like even like some of the infighting on the right, because I don't really pay too much attention to how they squabble with each other. But um, with respect to Charlie Kirk, I didn't know who he was. A lot of people had, very polarized opinions on his death. And it's just like I mean, like I don't know. The point being that after he died, I felt, kind of defeated. Honestly, I felt very defeated, deflated. Also, it felt it's hard to say. Like I know it's not like a there's definitely not even I wouldn't even say like a 30% confirmation of truth that to my prediction versus that moment happening. It could purely be coincidence, but at the same time, it all felt emotionally like overwhelming. A lot of things just all at the same time, and then like there's a very real like I just I dislike where we've gotten. Like even there was definitely like a certain period of time where I think everybody else saw what I kind of almost always feel like I see, which is that like, oh shit, like this could break out into like real like violence and stuff because the minute that Charlie Kirk died, the president of the United States was, on his platform saying that like the cause of his death was radical leftist. Like, how does that not make somebody want to kill a radical leftist? I mean, that at that point you feel like you're justified because, but like, it's like number one, there was no evidence of that yet. And I don't, even now it seems like blurry at most in the, it's like all of the, overall data with, even the guy that, tried to assassinate Trump, like it seems like there's not a lot of like um transparency, despite the most transparent, administration of all time, there's not a lot of transparency about who these people are, what their motives were. And I understand maybe they're still gathering data. Maybe it takes a very long time. Tucker Carlson always goes on his own conspiracy rants about like all things government. So,
sure, but I
I
think it's important, like motives or not, the general trend nonetheless has been the social and, well, obviously, more importantly, arguably, the physical justification of violence, right? Of, violence physically upon other people as a valid political strategy is something that has been something that's more agreed upon by individuals. And that
Right,
sort of agreement is going to point to violence. No matter the motivations of the individual, we have is a, political, social climate that is, more willing to justify violence. Not to say that, nation states, including the US, don't have systems of violence built and incorporated into them. Arguably, the United States is a much more violent system than the vast majority of countries. But right, it's that still extension of that violence. And just like a quick note, like to kind of relate that to the Overton window comment you made, I find it interesting the conversation of the Overton window is a shifting left, is a shifting right. I mean, yeah, statistically from a like general trend and tracking, like it's shifting right. But I think one of the real things that's happening is more of a Overton Canyon, right? Where you have like a lot of people shifting to the right, a kind of a gap in the middle, and then some other people kind of shifting,
right.
left. Like,
Further to the left, yeah.
yeah, exactly. So it seems to me more of an Overton Canyon. And when you get these sort of canyons, right, you get, people also more willing to use violence because there's a literal gap. There is no ability to come, together. So, yeah, I mean, these are simultaneously like existing trends within one another. It's no surprise that there is an increase in belief of the validation of, physical force upon political opponents at the same time as there's this developing Overton Canyon.
Right. And I mean, yeah, another way to look at it is like a pendulum swinging, right? The more, like the thing is that the more strict the liberals become in terms of what they what they will allow people who they disagree with to say, and then like the more pushback they're going to get from the right, and then vice versa. It just goes back and forth, and it doesn't necessarily, yeah, it's just like that's why, like, I've shifted my mindset a lot. I mean, not a lot. I'm still working on it. Like I'm very much a work in progress all time at all times, but like I'm trying to get more, and this is like kind of like part of the story that I was telling you. Like I'm trying to get more, into the center, because what I've kind of like finally took away, hopefully as like the lesson I need to learn, and I'm trying to teach myself, is that, it's like quicksand. The further, like the more I try to, or the more any like either side is outraged at the other side, the more it just causes, a back and forth of like, escalating violence. And like the only way to really to combat that, I think, is like to like just stay still, and like, but also I mean, like, it's just to be, at peace at one, it's like it's like when you look at like the philosophy of Jesus, forget, I'm not, specifically talking about, the religion, but the philosophy of Jesus is, kind of what heals all of these problems, I think. Which is just, even if I strongly disagree with this other person, I don't condemn them in any way. I have love for that person. I still like, even up to a point where, that person could be violent toward me. I still love that person. That is like, because I think the only way to actually get people to talk, to actually get people to change in a way that is meaningful, in a way that we can all agree on, um, is to first of all connect with each other and be able to understand and talk to each other on a human level, instead of like, yelling at each other, like, like we're just in a debate all the time. And the more, it becomes about competition, then I feel like the further divided we get. So after Charlie Kirk died, I just kind of
Well,
like, admittedly, I
but
kind of had like a little bit of a breakdown, like just like, like I was like crying in the in my living room, and like, because it was a lot of things, it's like other things as well that were going on, it was just a lot of emotion in that moment, and I felt it. I cried. I even prayed, right? Like, and like, because I didn't know. I've been trying everything I like. I want to fix the world's problems, and to some degree, that is one of my core problems, is that like I have a hard time accepting that, like, some of this is way, way above my pay grade. Like I don't have the resources to compete with people like Elon Musk or, Jeff Bezos or, Larry Ellison or whoever. But I like it's just the compassion in me that wants to like I want to see the world move in a different direction. I want everybody to be able to eat and not struggle. I want everybody to be able to like care about I'm actually like a family values type of person. Just, ironically, it's like I believe that we like our purpose is not to be born into a capitalist system where we're trying to extract as much money as we can. And live like on yachts and shit like but the reality is like a lot of people, if you really like actually earn that and you didn't get it inherited, then that means that you probably spent the majority of your life just working and like not being there for your family, for your friends, whatever. And like you're not really I think there's a lot of people who just aren't really, finding purpose in the sense of like, what is I would think fulfilling for me anyway. Because I just want I want people like I want kids to grow up and have lives better than what I had, right? I don't want them, to have even the same life I had, let alone one that's worse than mine. Um, and I don't want people to be struggling. I don't want people, I don't want people to be fighting. I don't want people to always like I don't want to feel like at any moment you're like, somebody is going to kill somebody because they're, left wing or right wing or whatever. I want, I want peace and generally like harmony, but I can't bring about that by myself. I don't have, I have ideas, and that's the part that is crazy because I do have like, I'm like I have like application ideas and things that I think like, oh, this could make the world a better place, but I never have the resources of like, to be like, Elon Musk where I could just like, oh yeah, I can make that app happen. I mean, I can create it myself, but I have to be able to, still pay my bills, and I don't necessarily have the time for that. So here's what happened is I broke down. I was like, I cried, I prayed, and like I was like, I don't know what to do. Like I don't know. Like in general, I've spent like the last like year or more just thinking a lot about purpose, thinking a lot about like I've been trying to learn more about like emotional intelligence because I wasn't really raised or taught to have that growing up, and so I've been like trying to improve on that. Um, but so I don't know. It's just like I I prayed and then like so number one, I mean, I use marijuana fairly frequently, so there that was also involved. So keep that in mind. But also, like I would say, I had what I consider to be like the closest thing that I've ever had to what I would consider to be like a spiritual experience, right? One that felt like supernatural, like more than just, human experience. So I feel like I judge myself for that. And it's kind of the same way, like, like when, even if I argue with, somebody who believes in, a particular religion, not argue, but like, debate or whatever. If if I talk to them, there is a very common like defense against that, which is just like, oh, like I just know because of like experiences I've had. Like, some people have claimed that, they themselves have had some kind of like interaction or some kind of like, experience or spiritual experience that they just know for certain, like gives them proof that God is
Yeah,
real and that
access to
that
the
divine.
divine.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, like I think in that sort of sense though, right? There's a you know, there, uh, there's a really good video right now out by Religion for Breakfast, and he's talking about the religion of animals, right? Like, can animals have religious experiences? And one of the, things he's coming back to is that sense of like awe and wonder and emotionality, right? That a lot of, you know, the commonalities between like religion and psychology is that like sort of wonderment, right? How people can talk about a concert being almost a religious experience, or going to a national park, right? Looking at the Grand Canyon as a, almost a religious or spiritual experience.
Right.
And, I think in that, right, like, there is, something heavy and important about certain events, right? Why certain events, as Plastic Pills puts quite well, like are like religious events, why we find religion in a lot of things. And Um, I guess as a quick note before letting you obviously get back, is that sort of sense of like one, like obviously all I can do is, share words of sympathy for the pain and, hurt that you felt, like that heavy, emotional weight. And obviously there was a lot of people with heavy emotional questions, after the moment in of itself, not just because of the moment that happened, but just of actions and reactions that people had around. I mean, I had many of my own students ask me my own thoughts of the event, and it was one of those things where, to me, the emotion I felt was a lot of disappointment, right? Seeing the combativeness and clashing of individuals really play out, right? This who's of stuff, which, we can look at, you know, uh, uh, Charlie Kirk as an individual. We can look at, the sort of usage of violence, right? And, we could look at those events, but for me, at least what I was highlighting and was troubling in the moment for me was um, the ready dismissiveness and the ready calls to violence that, millions, arguably, depending on, how you add things up, we're ready to advocate and call for the usage of harm upon one another.
But um, but yeah, so I mean, like I don't know. It's like I'm enough of a skeptic, and I know enough from like just I know a little things. Like I know some things, but like I know enough that like that the human brain is capable of playing tricks on people. Like if you believe strongly enough that you are sick, you can physically experience the the symptoms of being sick just based on like the way that your brain is processing it a lot and also when it comes down to like hypnotherapy. I think usually that works because people are willing to believe that it works. There's some to some degree I consider it like a placebo. So it's like I think about like in that moment like okay, I had what I considered to be like a spiritual experience, and I'll talk about that in a second. And it's not like that deep, but like I I also now look at it and I'm like, well, because I'm a skeptic, I'm like, well, okay, I was using marijuana. All right, so that's gonna put me in an altered state of mind. But in addition to that, I think that sometimes the mind does what it needs to do to protect itself. Like if I'm already in such a fragile state where I feel like I'm like emotionally like not doing very well, maybe my mind would kind of like just do what's needed to survive in that moment. I believe that that's possible. I would argue, and especially if you're an atheist, I'm not saying that you are, and nor am I, but I lean a little more toward atheism on the scale. If you're an atheist, you would just, say that like that is a more probable explanation for what happened than that, there was a real divine intervention, experience. So what I actually got out of my experience or whatever, it was all much, it was much more subtle than like, it wasn't like I had a voice speak to me and like, I understood like what it was that I'm supposed to do. But rather, I don't know. It's like in that moment, I don't know. It's like a lot of it now is already a blur. Like, and it was like an extended period of time for like almost like 48 hours or so after the event. And there was a lot of other things going on that, like, again, had me in a. I don't want to go into it too deeply because it's just like I don't want to put all the information out on the internet. But there was just other things that were keeping me like in a heightened state of like in my, fight or flight mode. And so, I'm critical of all those things, and I see that in myself. It's like a possibility that like okay, I fabricated all of this. But in that period of time afterwards, there's only two things that really like stuck out to me where I still kind of remember them, and one of which was like I listened to like maybe like an old country song. I can't remember. It's like a Tim McGraw song, and I was like, I was listening to. I had already heard the song. I actually heard it like I don't know when I heard it. Like like chronologically where I thought I was when I first heard it. I thought it was like, back in like 2005 or so, but it must have been like probably after like the Obama presidency. But it was like a song that like Tim McGraw had where like if I can paint this old town new again, color other than blue again. And I didn't fully think about like that line until that moment where I was just like, oh, he's talking about like political, like he wants the town to not be democratic because he painted new again, and he's blaming that, that he like basically that's how I interpret the line anyway. If I can make this town new again, color other than blue again, then that, he's basically saying the reason why it's like, the way that it is run down or whatever is because of, his perception of the Democrats. And then I also heard another song where like again, same thing. It's like I started to, I started to like feel like I understood like even like I don't know if you know the Benson Boone song or whatever. It's like bigger one. Uh da, 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 da. Beautiful things I got. That's something like that. But like he starts out or he starts out saying like things are better than the last four Decembers I recall. And then I was like, oh, he's talking about the election again because he's like the last four Decembers, meaning that the last four terms of that presidency. That's what I assume, or like not term, but the years of that presidency. So then I was like, oh, okay. I mean, I could be wrong, but this is what I heard in that moment. And then I was like listening to other things. I watched like a Kendrick Lamar at the Super Bowl. Like I like kind of like started like interpreting that a little bit. I don't know like what I fully concluded or whatever, but and I know you're like interested in Kendrick, and that could be a thing definitely talk about either today or one day. But getting but sticking to the yeah, I mean I don't know. It's like I just I almost felt like I was like I was starting like some of these songs I had heard before like many times, and I just didn't like it didn't even occur to me like, oh, this is politically motivated or something of that nature. And then like I also think about like I do maybe you can confirm or reject this, but and talking again about like kind of like propaganda and stuff, but like
Yeah.
there is I think that there it's hard to say because sometimes it's hard to tell like what is the money interest of like, oh, like this is we're gonna take this song and we're gonna blow it up and make it like the number one song because it has a message that we want all of our people to be able to hear, or if it's just like it naturally like we all just naturally want to hear that message
Well,
and
it can be
that
both, right?
yeah.
Like I think there is definitely something about certain songs, right? Whether they're, if they're made organically, right? There can still be that sort of sense of, oh, it aligns with our message.
Yeah.
And, there could be, the sort of, again, going back, manufactured consent, right? So it's the sense in which, like, yeah, sure, like, when the important thing about Chomsky's manufactured consent is that sense in which he's talking about how, you know, media incentives can still play out, the same corporate message, right? Because of the, desire for access, the desire for legitimacy, and that how that inherently has a popularity. Versus like discovering something that's made independently that can be put out, versus a corporate group putting out something that is to individuals as benefit, right? So we can look at country music, and Kendrick Lamar is good examples of this, right? That you have country music that happens to have a conservative message, and then you have artists within that genre, you know, realizing this very mindfully, knowing the target audience, and so making overtly political music, knowing that that's going to be popular. In the Kendrick Lamar case, it's hard to know what he's doing as an artist because he is very dynamic and different mentality than I think any other artist. I think his line of thinking is quite unique, but you can see, a lot of left-wing individuals attaching themselves to his message because of its already existent popularity. Oh, look, I put Kendrick Lamar in the tags. Now you have someone, coming to me, right? These things aren't um, unidirectional in the postmodern algorithmic world. Uh, what it is, it's, these things of like audience capture consciously or unconsciously. Because I think individuals realize their audiences can only be so large. You have Ben Shapiro talking about this pretty recently. He's like, look, as big as certain political commentators may seem to be, I think Ben was saying like his regular audience is about like 2 million people, right? That's Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? So he has a Tulsa, Oklahoma worth of people, and that's pretty big influence for one individual to have. But
Right,
also, he's pointing to on a relative scale, right? Like, you have, hundreds of, you have over 100 million people as a part of the electorate, right? The regular
right,
voting electorate, let alone the possible electorate. So, it's this sort of sense also where propaganda, can be, targeted and knowingly is, targeted, right? Or it can be very mass. You have very targeted propaganda like the stuff currently being put out by DHS, which is, these AI posters meant to be reminiscent of the 1950s for wink, wink, white supremacist reasonings. And
right,
then you have Freud's nephew with bacon for breakfast, this propaganda meant to target individuals in mass. And that's one of the tricky things about propaganda versus genuineness, right? Is the way in which um, things can become propaganda, how they're targeted, right? How something may just seem like normal existence for one individual, but another individual looks and goes, hey, that's clear, propaganda. And and it goes kind of into those little questions of free speech. But I don't want to elaborate too long because I know you just wanted the specific answer there. But as any good philosophy professor will do, right, your question brings up like 10
yeah.
other questions.
No, I know. I mean, like dude, I just like I sit in my head for too long, and then I just go down all the rabbit holes, and then I just never find my way back. But like, so what this eventually kind of led me to, um, and this is part of like why I wanted to talk to you again. Also, is like all of the everything just feels like interconnected in some way. So I just go off vibes, but but like. So I wasn't, I wasn't familiar at all with Taoism. And we barely talked about it, but you did bring up Taoism at one point in our last conversation, and then it was like right at that moment around the same time where like I'm in this state of like just I feel different. It's different than what I'm used to. And so somebody posted on Facebook, something about Taoism, and like, it's like, all right, whatever. I clicked on it, right? And so it was like a whole video, and it wasn't, it wasn't an official video. It was something that somebody made. I wouldn't claim in any way that it represents Taoism, let alone like the like Eastern version of Taoism. Like we like there is a more westernized, version of it. That I think, or at least from what I've heard, like, it's like if you really want to fully
Yeah, there's
embrace
the
it, you
notion
should learn the language and
of Dao Jai, which is the notion of Taoism apart from the context, right?
right,
So you have, and this is mainly the Taoism as initially communicated by Alan Watts, the um, British philosopher, who most of what his work entailed was translating quote unquote Eastern thought for a Western audience. So there are
right,
these very westernized forms of Eastern thought, be it through Alan Watts, be it through Hermann Hesse Siddhartha, and I think or Benjamin Hoff's The Tao of Pooh, right, which
right,
are very useful and do capture something about the philosophy, but um, they're not inherently inaccurate, but they miss out on the very context of the ways in which these ideas existed and are understood well within
right,
their home courts.
right. So it just like, yeah, but like when it happened, I just, it just it's hard to really explain unless you're in it and living it, but like everything unfolded in a way that it just felt like so it just felt like I was on autopilot. I wasn't really, driving. I was just I was seeing like what's going on, but I just didn't I wasn't necessarily in full control of it. Um and So I mean, like I watched this video, and like like there was like one particular point that reminded me of like my dad, he had like they had like the Freemason symbol. I think it's like a G with like a ruler or whatever. And like it's just like it happened at like a specific moment in a specific time as I'm like looking at the video, and I'm like it just like it just resonated with me in that moment. And also everything that the video said resonated with me on a lot of levels, and it kind of just it kind of made me understand like because I mean I've grown a little bit in terms of like like especially like when we talk about like what happened in the pandemic, right? Um, During the time of the pandemic, I very much like was and I still am like I still feel like this is the right thing to do. Um, but I was very much like in the camp of people like I was like of the perspective that like look, this like especially when you don't know like what the overall impact of the virus is going to be, and the fact that a virus is able to spread more versus being a super deadly virus actually kills more people than the super deadly virus. If it's like super deadly, then like it won't even be able to spread to enough people because all the people that get it will be dead. But if a virus has a higher probability of spreading, then it infects like 10 million people. But if it infects like whatever 10% of those people, then like a million die or something. But like the so I mean like I was of the perspective that like look like we need to do everything like I mean, like, I was also at the time I was also oblivious to like some of the things that were going on. Like, like after it was only after or like right before the election when like Mark Zuckerberg put out like a statement saying like, oh, the Biden administration, was pressuring us to suppress like, misinformation around like the vaccines. So I mean I didn't agree with that, but I didn't know that that was happening until after like until like the point of the election. I don't think that our government should be like I don't know like I don't think our government should be influencing like it really depends. It's a really like a fine like you have to thread the needle very finely because it it becomes such because it's such a like a controversial topic. I feel like there's so many different directions that like I
Yeah.
feel like have to be covered. But like
Well,
yeah, go.
we can certainly wrap a couple of things I think that you're saying, right? And even some pins earlier. So, right, your focus on Taoism, right, connects earlier to a statement that you were talking about with stillness, where it's like, oh, in the midst of all this chatter, in the midst of all
And
this
that's where I
discussion.
learned it from. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Right. So it's that sort of sense of like, oh, okay, I'd like to be, still within these things, right? You have Taoism being a philosophy that, advocates for political non-participation, yet the Boxer Rebellion was very much largely a Taoist sort of push. So it's this sort of sense where for the Taoists, right, it's this advocacy not inherently for non-participation, but this sort of, action that allows for non-action, or more commonly put, in, English phraseology, live and let live.
right.
And I think that's an attitude that can be carried when it comes to free speech matters, right? Because without a live and let live sort of thing, you can end up with a 1984 style slide of extreme suppression.
Right.
However, live and let live has major consequences, right? Individuals being, misinformed about, medical matters, being misinformed about political matters, being misinformed about matters of, evolutionary biology, just to name a handful of examples. And one of the things that you also brought up earlier was, these notions of free speech for thee and not for me, right? The sort of way that free speech can be used as a bludgeon. And so what we have here, right, is this sort of sense of, okay, how do we balance between the consequences of, stillness, right? The consequences of just letting things, just kind of be out there informationally, versus the consequences of that sort of suppression.
And I think
And
that tension is something I grapple with a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of people do. And I think the issue at hand is the sort of way that free speech gets mixed up, because ultimately it is a governmental principle, right? That the idea of free speech is something that is a legal right. However, right, we often talk about the principle of free speech. So if Facebook removes content, right, it's not a free speech violation because, well, it's not a governmental entity violating expression. However, there's also that sense where, oh, social media is the new public square, which now includes a bunch more bots than it used to, but that's a whole nother sort of thing. So I think the question at hand is, I think, yeah, from a governmental perspective, right? The government should not be able to, sort of suppress, right? I guess this is my free speech, extremism. It's like the government is already too powerful of an entity having the monopoly on violence to be able to suppress like opinions and thoughts and notions, because we see how government's suppressing speech expressions, right? Even if we're talking about like outfits, be it in France or Iran, right, can lead to, a lot of harm. But also this sort of sense of which like private entities, right? There's this question of do they have a responsibility given that they are, disseminators of information to maybe not like censor certain speech, but to again like do stuff like community notes and watermarks where the ideas therein exist, but none the less um um what's the word I'm looking for? Oh yeah, the ideas there and still exist, so it's not, a violation or suppression of the ideas, but there's also this sort of connection to notes. But again, now that, that has been tried and maybe it had success, maybe it didn't, but even those, regulations are going away with, cultural changes. And so it's a sort of sense of like what, are the more consequential consequences? Are we more concerned about, these 1984 matters, or quite frankly, the matters that we find ourselves in a, post-truth era where, medical misinformation is leading to,
More
deaths of
death.
children,
Yeah.
yeah, in New Mexico and Texas, right? So, but again, that suppression can also lead to death. So yeah, there's not a like, aha, I have the, perfect answer here, but I go with the lack of at least governmental suppression, right? That's where I hold my extremism. And then in the hopes that like, hey, right, like um, you can provide social pressures, which, happened for a while, and like, social argumentation towards proper information. Because at the end of the day, right, this isn't post-truth isn't like a brand new thing. There has been conspiracies and misinformation, for, basically the entirety of our species' informational history.
It does seem like there was a time when especially like like I don't know if 90s is the peak time there was, but there was definitely a time I feel like when a lot of the media was controlled by like, I mean, American media was controlled to some degree by the government, or at least the billionaire interests that fund the government. And that could be just corporations or stuff. Because what I feel like, the way I perceive, kind of like what has happened over the last, election cycle was that, the Democrats and even like, the old like, establishment more so Republicans, I feel like they were mostly owned, and I'm just, hyperbolizing, but they were owned by like, bigger corporations, like insurance industries and or different lobbyists that are basically kind of putting money in their pockets so they can run, and then they win because you can't win without money, and then once you win, then like you can basically kind of like put in laws that will help the people that paid you. Um, and I see that happening between like both Republicans and Democrats. But that is like, you can think of like, that could be like the Costco's, the Walmarts, the, or like the insurance companies like, United Healthcare, b big Pharma, whatever, whatever. Um, but these are all like the corporations, probably the majority of like the S&P 500 and like the owners of those or the the board shareholders of those probably had a lot of like influence on the government, which like therefore whether the people in the corporations were the ones buying the media outlets or the government themselves was like involved in some way. It seemed like they had a better control of what the narrative was. And
Yeah.
and now once you introduce the internet and then you introduce social media, then now it starts getting a lot more fractured, and now it's
Yeah,
harder
because not
to
everyone
control the
has
narrative.
the same narrative. Not everyone is, coming together and being like, "Hey, did you see the episode of Cheers?" Right
Right,
now, I mean, there are still mass phenomenon like Stranger Things as a good example at this present moment. But again, like the collective unity behind narratives is not the same. And so while our condition has always been postmodern, it's it is more so postmodern, given the fact that like it is clear the lack of a grand unifying narrative. I mean,
right,
for me, my I guess go-to example of this is to see the re-rise of flat eartherism, right? The sort of sense of, yeah, by a population, we're, globally, we're not at like the highest, per capita, understanding of like flat eartherism, but as a raw number, there might be more flat earthers on the earth today than there ever have been at any point in human history, right? And what we have in that sort of sense is again, like, well, what do we do in the midst of someone, proclaiming information that does not correspond to reality? That's one of the other issues there, that just because one is open to free speech does not mean that, like, hey, I cannot argue with your speech, does not mean I cannot disagree, with your speech, or doesn't even mean I cannot judge your, sort of speech, right? Going back to those Christian notions you mentioned, judge not lest you be judged yourself. It's like, okay, well, I'm okay with judgment right back, right? That sort of sense, like, all right, fine, judge not lest you be judged yourself. You can take that as don't judge, or you can also take that as, hey, maybe there are appropriate times to judge, and if I am judged in return, that may be okay, depending on its context and what's being judged. And
right,
so, yeah, I think the difficulty that we have therein is that balance between, letting people talk their talk, but also, right, what we have is an environment that, it's not a letting people talk their talk. And in that, though, that doesn't mean the best information is going to win out, but there's just not enough, advocacy of the truth. What there is a lot of advocacy of are individuals propagating their narrative in the midst of grand narratives to, again, go back to those themes of like capture, right? Even governments have this sense of audience capture, this sort of sense of like, okay, we can't get everyone, but how much power can I hold? And that's kind of the issue at hand, right? There's not a concern of the truth. There is a concern of, sort of, treating individuals as object numbers, be it through social media, be it through electorates, right? How can, I put out particular narratives to get individuals as object numbers to join my side,
right.
my platform,
Um,
whatever it may be.
yeah, I have like two like kind of like completely almost separate thoughts, but I want to throw them out there
Hmm.
because you're like really good at like when I have disjointed thoughts, you're like really good at tying them together somehow. Like it's it's insightful. But all right, so what I was kind of saying, I'll just like go through a couple things. So what I was saying was so yeah, everything okay. When I look at like establishment Democrats, establishment Republicans, they were owned by like these corporate interests more or less. And just hyperbole, but whatever. So what I see, us moving toward is that now, um, what I see this moving toward is now we have, an even smaller minority of like wealthier people who like made all their money during the pandemic, which is, people like Elon Musk, people like Larry Ellison, people like Mark Zuckerberg, who are now like, the wealthiest people in the world. And now those are the people who are kind of getting control more than anything because they have so much money that they can compete with, corporations as individuals. Um, and so they have so much influence. But they're also doing the exact same thing. How I was saying earlier, like, the internet fractured communication. Like, this is actually maybe this is like probably like one of the more like important things I might say. So the like because I can't remember where it was, but I heard somebody saying somewhere that, like, really a lot of the way that everything has, ultimately shaped out is based on how we communicate with each other. And whenever you have like big technological advancements where people are able to communicate, like, like the telephone or like the internet, where like people are able to sync up with each other and start exchanging ideas, that obviously it leads to a lot of things, but one of the things that it leads to is maybe it's harder for, like, an elite group to control any narrative, period. And so what I saw pretty much was that when the internet came out, it fractured a lot of that communication. Like prior to the internet, let's just say the elites. I don't know. I don't want to know if it's like the government or like the corporations. The people that own these companies and the people that own these media outlets are almost always tied together to one of those two things. Um, and so, um, when the internet came out, there was it became harder to, because now before all you had to do was, if you want to get a narrative about, like, we want to attack, Afghanistan because of the war. All you had to do was put that on the TV because that was like the majority of where people got their information. You put it in the newspaper, okay, that's another place where people get their information. Now you have podcasts, you have social media, and that like gets divided. I mean, even like if you go to Reddit, it's like, hundreds and or not even hundreds,
Yes.
thousands of different like
But
subreddits. So,
what we can't say of the internet, which is very true as a quick note, there's this idea, well, set of ideas that Deleuze and Guattari put out, the notion of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. And so the internet, has been a deterritorializing force, right? It took information that would previously just be on the TV or a few newspapers and disseminated it across, like, more niche websites. But
right.
then for Deleuze and Guattari, every deterritorialization, not every, but many of them follow up with a reterritorialization, where, okay, now you have a few choice websites that people go to. So even with the vastness of the potential internet, right,
Well, yeah,
most of the
I just feel
information
like
is
they're moving back
confluenced.
towards concentrating it
Correct.
and taking over
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
power.
So it's a sort of sense of like guys like Larry Ellison and Elon Musk, right? Mark
Who, by the way,
Zuckerberg.
just to point out, like, he bought TikTok, and he bought Skydance, which means that, like, he's not only influencing the message that people are getting on TikTok, he's going to be influencing the people that people are getting. Then you also have like Netflix doing like the merger with HBO, so it's
Right.
like, you have more monopolies, you have more concentration of, all of the main places where people get their information getting owned by a very few number of people, and that helps control the narrative. When I was younger, I was on YouTube at, like, more like toward the beginning of like the YouTube era, and it was way different than it is right now. Now it is actually very commercialized. Back then it was a lot more like TikTok, where anybody could upload. Like, I uploaded a song and it wasn't very good. It wasn't, I didn't have a flashy video, but I was able to get, hundreds of thousands of views. But it was just because it was possible back then. Just like at one point, it was possible for anybody to upload a thing on TikTok and get, a million views. As time progresses, it always moves towards, like, oh, we're gonna silence those people. This is where, like, how much can the individual really have their voice put out there? Like, even this conversation that you and I are having, that's definitely gonna like be pushed very far down the algorithm compared to, like, like celebrities, really. I mean, like, and
Yeah,
and,
because
and that's
Kai
how they
Cenat and
kind of
Mr. Beast
control
are
what the
celebrities
narrative
at this
is.
point. Yeah, right. Like there's the internet celebrity thing, and it's the sense once again, right? You have these apps that deterritorialize certain information. They themselves can become, hegemons in a sense. And then what you have again is that reterritorialization back into particular modes. That doesn't mean something isn't broken down in the process. But, it's as Deleuze and Guattari point out, it's like, hey, you have these sorts of shifts that aren't as seismic as like Hegel would put out, right? Because Hegel talks about these syntheses of ideas creating kind of bigger changes. And Deleuze and Guattari point out in their own, thesis, antithesis, synthesis sort of notion of like, hey, actually, like the changes may ultimately just kind of, appear big, but they ultimately keep the same superstructure of what's going on. So TikTok at first, it's like, oh, it's Chinese, it's short form, it's quick, it's rapid, it's going to change the nature of entertainment. And yeah, there have been some changes to like attention span and models and modes of consumption and appeals to advertising. But is that really radically different from, it's like, oh, okay, what's the real radical difference between advertising, on, a TV show versus advertising on, a TikTok? What's the real difference between, sponsoring an athlete versus sponsoring an influencer? So it's these sorts of questions also of like, hey, like, um, the even ability to make change with, our sort of speech and our sort of influence on, tons of spaces.
Um, I, I had a topic I wanted to get into, but I think like I would love to, some other day in the future,
Yeah,
and maybe like talk more maybe about hip hop because I think,
heck
like
yeah.
building off of like the point that I was, kind of going at was I feel like I saw that in music too, where like, the internet. I think the internet, like somebody like, for example, Lupe Fiasco is my best example, I think, where, when the internet came out, Lupe Fiasco was still kind of underground. Not a lot of people knew about him. His popularity kind of took off after his album got leaked. So it originally got leaked, and then he ended up changing a few of the songs on it, and then re-released it with like different production and different a couple different songs than the original one. But when I don't know, like if let me just go full conspiracy theory. If I were to think that like the government were a shadowy figure and able to kind of control our narrative, and there's always been like there's been speculation about like putting crack in the hood and things like that. If I were fully invested in this conspiracy theory, I would say that it would make sense to me that the government like interfered in some way or government or corporate interest, or you could just say that it's the where the money led. And going back to what you had mentioned about like kind of P Diddy like corporatizing hip hop. It seems like the government at one point kind of had more control over the narrative of what hip hop was, or not even the government, but whoever the elite interests that are trying to keep whatever agenda going. I don't know exactly what that agenda is, but it seemed like, a lot of the music was like only about one thing. And it was like there was a very kind of like suppression of like, conscious rap music. There was a suppression of in my mind anyway, and like closer to the 90s, around the Diddy era, around like, that more like especially like, when the South became really popular, white tees and all that. Even though that's mainstream, even though underground has always existed, but like Lupe Fiasco and Kanye West are both, markers of like mainstream success where wokeism kind of got back into I think the mainstream like popular music. And it feels like the internet had a lot to do with that. And like it feels like now we're again like,
Yeah, hip hop is a lot more like seemingly repetitive, and if
right.
anything, it's on a decline compared to country as a result because the main social image is a conservative one, and it's like, why would I want this repetitious image of debauchery, which isn't as popular in the zeitgeist right now? And not to say there aren't guys like Mick Jenkins doing, good and interesting stuff, or even Chance has had like a little comeback.
There's a ton of incredibly good
But
rappers,
but
but
in
yeah.
regards to what's projected, it's exactly we're in that another cycle of it being like, repetitive and flashy. And there will be kind of another conscious push again, but there's those questions of like right now, in a time that there may be a need for radical music, right? A genre that at times has been radical through guys like, Grandmaster Flash is not showing any real, radicalism, not showing any pushback against the powers that be, and if anything is embracing like a sort of corpse of the former zeitgeist.
Right. I know you got to go soon, so I just had one last thing I wanted to throw out because this is like maybe my like argument for why I think, free speech, should have some bounds, right? So are you familiar with Boxy, right? So this was a girl that, like, I don't know, she was on 4chan at one point. She came out with a YouTube video. She was kind of like bubbly and, not, I don't know, just bubbly and just like saying nonsense a lot. But she was very cute and, like, somehow for some reason 4chan blew up over her. It was a big thing. I don't know all the details, but I mean, this is just one example. I mean, this happens all the time, doxing in general. But this is what I mean. Like, I don't think like doxing. I would
Well,
argue
doxing's not a form of speech.
is it not? I mean, like if you're on the internet and you say, oh, like this person lives at that house, and then
No,
like
what is so it's the again it's the dilemma of like yelling, fire in a movie theater where there is no fire. What is being punished there is not the usage of the word fire. What's being punished in the case of doxing is not the giving, it's not the literal like numbers and words behind an address. Was being punished in the doxing case is like, hey, violating consent, right, and exposing someone to harm. With the fire situation, it's not being punished is the word fire, but the causing of public harm, right?
right.
So that's kind of the thing there. It's like you don't
But I,
punish the
I don't
words in
think
and
that
of
that
themselves.
I don't think that conversation was ever like fully like rectified though. I mean, there are still people that disagree with I think, like the yelling fire in a crowded theater.
Yeah, there's disagreements, but I think in the sort of sense of like, sensible interpretation, right? Um,
I mean, sensible is also subjective, right?
yes,
Like
yes, yes. But in that sort of sense of
I mean,
again,
I agree
as
with
a
you.
option of sensible interpretation, right? Not
Right.
like the only sensible interpretation, right? There is that sense of like, hey, right? The punishment of speech acts, right, as framed in, the First Amendment, right? Because free speech is not, a global universal, right? You have free speech put next to, free press and free religion. So clearly the intent therein is ideological, right? In the context of the other things, right? Sensible in the sense of, putting it in sense with the other, freedoms placed therein, right? The notion of the freedom of speech implicitly, implied in there is not, oh, like, literally, no words could cause harm or detriment, right? Because, well, no. But it's that sort of sense therein. It's like, hey, you will not be punished for the speech in of itself, especially on an ideological, religious, basis, right? However, right, there's obviously sections about sedition. There's obviously sections about bribery, right, within the pre-amendment aspects of the Constitution. So clearly there is this understanding that words can cause harm. So
Well,
yeah,
can, but like, let's say, like if I post somebody's address, right? Um, is like I can argue that like I had no ill intent. Like I just like, oh, this person lives there. And then, I just said that and is that not part of my speech? I mean, whether something happens to that person or not, I don't know. And I don't condone this at all. I think doxing is terrible. I think like that's why I'm making this argument because, I think
yes, you
that
can
it
make
shouldn't
the
be allowed. I don't think, you know,
yeah, there are certain principles that are, again, this is the part of like legal judgment, right? That you can make arguments of intent versus arguments of action, right?
right.
So there are certain crimes where intent matters, thus the, degrees of murder. However, in these sort of cases, right, yeah, punishments may be reduced on the basis of intent, but not eliminated. So it's like, okay, yeah, your intent was just to, for whatever reason, show someone's address harmlessly,
I,
but like the
these are the arguments,
yeah,
I see people make
but
sometimes.
at the end of the day, right, the action was still there and committed, right? You may have been, for example, let's say you're in the movie theater and, like, your friend shows you a fire TikTok, right? And then, someone
That should
misunderstands
be
it
like a
as the
commercial or something.
right, right, right. Oh, fuck, whatever, right? So, like, again, right, in that case, maybe the intent would be taken into account because it's like, no, like I was looking at a fire TikTok, I yelled the word, right? Again, the judgment could be laid there indifferently. However, what's being punished in the doxing case is not the numbers and the um address words, but the punishment there is like, hey, like your intent or not still caused, the potentiality or actuality for harm, right? The fire thing, your words, right, even outside the intent of, the TikTok or whatever, response, still caused harm. And
Right.
yeah, again, there are sensible arguments against this, but in terms of like mainline legal interpretation, right? That's why in the US context, like, slander and libel are really hard to prove. But, what's, not being punished there is not your, again, usage of those words. What is being punished is the harm that was caused therein by those words. So you are allowed to say those words,
Right.
but what's being punished is the harm. And again, this is why like slander and libel is really hard to prove against like public figures because,
Right.
right, there's exaggeration, there's, comedy, there's parody, etc. of the sort.
Right. Yeah, I mean like yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean like I do think that like, there is a level of conventional wisdom where we just don't really talk about the nuances at all. It's like, do you believe in free speech or do you not believe in free speech? And then like
Yep. The
it
ways
doesn't.
convos are limited.
Yeah. And especially this is like the unfortunate part of like, when you have politics where everything is reduced, where like literally like half of the country is reduced to being red or being blue. Now, like what do all these people in like this big, umbrella all think? And
Yeah.
but it's like it always comes down to, are you pro gay marriage or anti-gay marriage? Are you pro trans or anti-trans? But it's never, let's talk about like the details in between, where the boundaries are, where the lines in the sand.
Yeah,
Like,
and that's why you made a comment earlier about like almost running to the center, and I'm not even, I'm definitely not even for that, right? Like, some people can be categorically put into certain camps, and these categories should just be like an happenstantial indicator of the things you think, but don't necessarily need to define you. So for me, right, like I will say I'm part of the left out of convenience, but really, if we're getting down to the nuance of my position, right, I'm reformist in my political thinking, right? I very much believe in regular constant reform, a what could be called a form of, social democracy, right? Where, there is, a constant evaluation of reform. And, if we, look again at that big umbrella, right, there is a lot more nuance as what people want to shift and change as opposed to, exactly what you're saying, left or right. And I think you're saying it quite well. It's not about, running towards one camp or the other, but being better at like understanding the nuance and details, not just of others, but in our own, political and social modes of thought.
yeah. Yeah, so I mean like on that, we can definitely wrap up, but as always, I appreciate talking with
Yeah, I
you.
appreciate this right back. This was fantastic.
Yeah. So I mean, keep in touch. I'll reach out to
100%.
you, especially once I get all this edited. It might take a little longer than usual because I gotta scramble around to get my editing software set up and everything.
All good, all good. It was fantastic. We got into a lot of things, but they came succinct. And again, that's something very nice about talking with you. You are, very open at putting out a lot of stuff and exploring and investigating. And hey, we need a lot more of that sort of energy of reconsideration and reevaluation in the world.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, like, yeah, it's crazy because like I said, I wouldn't call myself a Taoist, but I've been like more, I'm more open to that idea. And it fit like everything I already believed, right? It wasn't like a shift because like I didn't have to go from like, oh, I don't believe in any form of like divine intervention into I believe in divine intervention or whatever. Like
Yep.
Taoism is very kind of abstract in the sense that like, it doesn't tell you what you have to believe. It's just kind of like you just are. And then like, I've like kind of like started to see like it's like I think in general people just don't like to be controlled, and that's kind of like where our problem tends to be, I think, in our society, is that like we feel like we have to get our ideology across, but we have to yell people into submission, into believing like what we believe or whatever, and not really like connecting on an individual level and being like, well, what do you believe? Why do you believe that? And genuinely like in faith, good faith, trying to like to have deeper conversation. But I'm working on like my own my own forms of
As
judgment
we
and
all
like
are.
yeah. But yeah, I mean like we can wrap this up.
Adios, Alan.
Thank you so much, and yeah, have a great day, man.
You too.
All right, see you.
Bye.